Ladies and gentlemen, excellences, dear students of the Gregorian University, I would like to warmly welcome you to this afternoon's panel discussion. Our part of the conference is focusing on reflecting on Nostra Aetate chapter 4. During the Second Vatican Council, there was controversy not only about which document should address the Catholic Church's relationship with Judaism. Another major topic of discussion was how the Church's attitude toward Judaism could be placed on a different footing after the Shoah. The path away from the doctrine of contempt led to a change into the theological framework regarding Israel and Judaism. To the extent that Nostra Aetate chapter 4 uses chapters 9 to 11 from Paul's epistle to the Romans as a backdrop, the question arises as to what this means for previous teaching practice and what this means for us today. To this end, the Council has established a criterion against which it must be measured again and again. I quote, "The Church, therefore, cannot forget that she received the revelation of the Old Testament through the people with whom God, in His inexpressible mercy, concluded the ancient covenant. Nor can she forget that she draws sustenance from the root of that well-cultivated olive tree onto which have been grafted the wild shoots, the Gentiles. Indeed, the Church cannot forget." Our panel is taking place in a changed context. We are 60 years after Nostra Aetate. We are 2 years after 10/7. There are a lot of questions and challenges arising. Those who link Israel's war against Hamas to the Shoah are not only overstepping the bounds of historical comparability. In the context of a conference on the significance of Nostra Aetate, the fundamental question also arises as to how lasting the lessons of Nostra Aetate chapter 4 are. Those who link the claim to the land with the temptation of Satan are using the language of demonizing Israel. Yesterday and today, the Nostra Aetate addresses of Pope Leo make clear that the Church is unbreakable bond with the Jewish people. The Church cannot forget. Has Nostra Aetate brought about a real change in the relations between non-Catholic churches and Judaism? What challenges lie ahead? What do they mean for the rereading of Nostra Aetate chapter 4? We will explore this complex topic from different perspectives in this panel discussion. From the point of view of a Protestant and a Catholic theologian, primarily in conversation with 3 Jewish voices. The panel will proceed as follows. We start with Rabbi Noam Marantz, Director of Interreligious Affairs at American Jewish Committee and former chair of the International Jewish Committee for Interreligious Consultations. He will give a talk, I hope so. He will give a talk about the importance of having other religious traditions in a conference of Nostra Aetate. Then we will have papers from Rabbi David Meyer, professor at the Cardinal Beer Center for Judaic Studies at the Gregorian Pontifical University, Etienne Beteux, auxiliary bishop of Reims and former director of the Beer Center, and Karma Ben Yochanan, professor for comparative religion at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, which look at Nostra Aetate 4 with the general idea of pointing out, after 60 years, what is missing in the document or what does not correspond to the idea the Jewish tradition has about itself. The last talk will be given by Axel Töllner, representative of the Evangelical Lutheran Church in Bavaria for Jewish-Christian dialogue. He deals with the importance of Nostra Aetate for the relations between non-Catholic Christian faith and Judaism. After this follows a 10 minutes break. You can use it for a coffee break, but also perhaps to talk with your neighbors, note down any questions. And after the break, we have a short round on the podium. Everyone can name one aspect that was important to them in the other presentations to emphasize or to address a question. This will be followed by around about 30 minutes of discussion with the audience. And allow me to ask you not to give co-presentations, but a short comment, precise questions, and so on, and so on. I'm sorry. And at least we should have time for a final round on the podium. What do you take away from the panel as an inspiration? My name is Gregor Maria Hoff, and I have the honor of guiding you through this panel as moderator. And now, the 5 minutes talk of Noam.
Thank you. When reflecting on his involvement in the process which yielded Nostra Aetate, Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, who had lost most of his family in the Shoah, said that it was an opportunity to save Jewish lives. 2 millennia of Christian anti-Jewish teaching had provided a foundation for contempt, violence, and murder directed at Jews. Heschel reasoned that Jewish engagement could help shape the necessary Christian change of thinking on Jews and Judaism. If a Catholic hand was being extended, Heschel thought, then a Jewish hand was needed to grasp it. Heschel's existential understanding of what was at stake for the Jewish people may explain why, in my experience, Jewish leaders are often more proprietary about Nostra Aetate than the leaders of other faiths. And of course, for the Jewish people, the Vatican Declaration has more content than it has for other faith groups, reflective of Nostra Aetate's origin story, as clearly remembered by Cardinal Koch last night and by Pope Leo last night and this morning. And yet, 60 years on, we are happily gathered at a conference that is much more inclusive. It brings together scholars and leaders of diverse faiths to discuss Nostra Aetate in the context of Catholic relationships with multiple faiths, named and unnamed in the Declaration. The conference planners asked me to quickly reflect on a Jewish communal interreligious affairs professional perspective on the meaning and value of that diversity. As we turn our attention to section 4, it is inspiring to reflect upon the way Nostra Aetate facilitated Judaism's evolving relationship with the world's religions beyond Catholicism. There have been moments when Jewish interreligious milestones can be attributed directly to Nostra Aetate, but often it is the more nebulous spirit of Nostra Aetate that ushered in a new era of Jewish interreligious relations. In response to a request from the Vatican Commission for Religious Relations with the Jews, the Jewish community founded in the early 1970s an umbrella organization mentioned the International Jewish Committee for Interreligious Consultations, affectionately known as IJKIC, that is recognized by the Commission as its official dialogue partner with World Jewry. Today it includes 11 major Jewish organizations, including American Jewish Committee, AJC, and is a vehicle for expanding Jewish interreligious relations. It was the IJKIC-Vatican relationship which inspired parallel relationships within wider Christianity in the 1970s and 80s, including major initiatives of IJKIC and the Lutheran World Federation, and IJKIC and the Ecumenical Patriarchate. In 1983, on the 500th anniversary of Martin Luther's birth, the Lutheran World Federation and IJKIC issued a series of statements, one by Lutherans, one by IJKIC, and one jointly. The Lutheran statement very dramatically proclaimed, quote, "We Lutherans take our name and much of our understanding of Christianity from Martin Luther, but we cannot accept or condone the violent verbal attacks that the Reformer made against the Jews." Lutheran rejection of the anti-Jewish teachings of their own denomination's namesake was a remarkable act of religious courage. In 1977, IJKIC and Orthodox Christianity inaugurated the first of now 11 academic consultations that have assured steady progress in addressing Christian-Jewish relations, including the direct involvement of the ecumenical patriarch himself. These are just some examples of the wider impact Nostra Aetate had on interreligious relations between Jews and Christians. And beyond Christianity, Judaism's encounter with Hinduism and Buddhism continues to unfold, inspired by Nostra Aetate. In the first decade of this century, 3 Hindu-Jewish summits in Delhi, Jerusalem, and the US broke new ground. Swami Dayananda Saraswati proclaimed at the Delhi gathering in 2007, Hindu-Jewish dialogue will act as a benchmark for others to follow and emulate, resulting in a better environment for one and all. Perhaps the most renowned Buddhist-Jewish encounter happened during a 1990 Jewish leadership mission to Tibet to meet with the Dalai Lama, chronicled in Roger Kamenitz's The Jew in the Lotus. In 1989, the same year he was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize, the Dalai Lama exclaimed to the Jewish people, quote, "Tell me your secret, the secret of Jewish spiritual survival in exile." But no encounter with the Jewish people is more important and fraught today than its encounter with Islam. Although it is commonly asserted that historically the Jewish experience in Muslim lands was overall better than the experience in Christian lands, the reality is that the Middle East conflict has politicized Muslim-Jewish relations. Nonetheless, there are both dramatic successes and some reason for hope that we might have a window today for greater Muslim-Jewish reconciliation. Dare we hope that the Holy Land's recent extended darkness, now followed by some limited light, let's make it up to date, some interrupted limited light, might yet become a darkest before the dawn moment. The more tangible, dramatic Muslim-Jewish successes include the Abraham Accords, which were built upon an existing foundation of interreligious dialogue, and of course the Marrakesh Declaration, whose 10th anniversary is coming up in January. That declaration by hundreds of Muslim leaders calls for protection of religious minorities in Muslim-majority countries and was launched in the presence of invited Jewish leadership. I'm getting the evil eye already. We at JJC like to say that, I'm almost finished, really, 30 seconds, that notwithstanding the obvious differences in the relationships, we want to advance Jewish-Muslim relations in the 21st century the way we contributed to the successful advancement of Christian-Jewish relations in the 20th century. In short, as we begin a deep dive into Nostra Aetate, we are mindful of and inspired by the example it has set for Jewish and other bilateral and multilateral interreligious relations initiatives. Thank you very much.
No, thank you very much for your almost 5 minutes talk.
Jewish 5 minutes.
David, the floor is yours.
Well, let me start with words that I consider as words of wisdom. They come from a contemporary rabbinic poet called Edmond Jabès. And one particular book of Jabès merits, I think, our attention today. It's the Book of Dialogue. It's a fitting title for our discussion. Here is what Jabès wrote in the Book of Dialogue. When the question was raised, is there such a thing as dialogue? He replied, there is pre-dialogue, our slow and feverish preparation for dialogue without any idea of how it will proceed. And then there is post-dialogue, or after silence, for what we manage to say to the other in our exchange of words says virtually nothing but silence. And then finally, there is what could have been the actual dialogue, vital, irreplaceable, but which, alas, does not take place. It begins the very moment we take leave of one another and we return to our solitude. Now, 60 years after Noah's Nostra Aetate, this place of solitude is possibly where we find ourselves, in a moment of intimacy, hopefully not post-dialogue, but maybe a pause in dialogue. And it is from that place of intimacy and of solitude that I want to share 2 reflections. Each of these will begin with a passage from Nostra Aetate, and each time I will turn to rabbinic tradition, to contemporary also Jewish and Christian voices, to think again, but maybe differently, about the words of Nostra Aetate. The 2 reflections I will refer to both have something in common. They share a certain opacity, a tension that is not meant to be resolved, but to make us face the creative intellectual potential of ambiguities in friendship. And let me illustrate with a very short midrashic teaching that I believe sets the tone. It's a midrashic formulation that I see as a conceptual key for reassessing Nostra Aetate section 4. In Midrash Tanchuma, like in many ancient rabbinic texts, the biblical figure of Esau appears as the symbol of the kingdom of Edom, then of Rome, and then of Christianity. This is a very well-known rabbinic typology. And surprisingly, Esau/Rome/Christianity is first described as an arrogant power, a kingdom that is destined for fire and for destruction. And there is clearly nothing nice, nothing friendly in this. The Midrash, however, takes a sudden, surprising turn, a turn that I think should interest us. I cite, "In the word to come, Esau will wrap himself in a talit, a prayer shawl, appearing like a Jewish sage, and he will come to sit next to Jacob. And Jacob will say to him, Ata achi, al te'i achi. You are my brother, do not be my brother." The midrashic formulation is astonishing. It exposes a paradox, one that can only be explored in the intimate solitude of a certain pause in dialogue, when we have time to reflect about the possible wisdom of a fraternity, Ata achi, you are my brother, that expresses itself through the gesture of its own refusal. Al te'i achi, do not be my brother. It's what I call a fraternity in resistance. This paradox will accompany us through the 2 movements I want to share. The first one will illustrate our fraternity and a Jewish resistance, and the second one will illustrate our fraternity and possibly a Christian resistance. So let's start with the first movement. Nostra Aetate speaks, as we've heard, as the well-cultivated olive tree into which Gentiles are grafted. The image, of course, is strong. It expresses dependence and continuity. But 60 years after, another dimension has emerged. I think of it as theological warmth. And let me try to explain what is in my mind. To do so, I will turn briefly to the Mishnah, the first code of Jewish law, more or less 2nd century. The text I'm about to read has nothing to do, absolutely nothing to do with our topic, at least at first, but if we take the time, maybe for a short legal detour, I hope to make it somehow relevant. The sages ask, may one draw water from a vessel that retains heat on Shabbat? Now, this is a very legal question. Work is not permitted on Shabbat, fire is forbidden, so heating water becomes forbidden. And yet the Mishnah tries to ask, is there a way to make warm water available for warmth or pleasure? The Mishnah then continues and becomes quite technical. It talks about the miliarium that has been cleansed from its hot coals that we can drink from. It's hot water on Shabbat. But it says there is another device called the antichi, which is a kind of a boiler from Antioch, a kind of a Greek boiler from Antioch. And it says, even there, if all the hot coals have been removed, then one cannot use its hot water on Shabbat. Now, both terms refer to Greco-Roman kinds of boilers, and I am not an expert in it, but what is clear is that not all warmth may be drawn upon. So far for the text. But why does it interest me? Because while references to Greco-Roman terminology to express technical terms is far from unusual, and indeed one easily finds rich and varied Hebrew terminology for Jewish boilers, the superfluous turning to Latin and Greek origin in this Mishnah invites us to consider that there might be more to our text than simply boiling water. Now let's be clear, the text, legal intent, is unequivocal. However, the imagery it employs invites, at least for the purpose of this reflection, an interpretative transposition beyond its legal scope. Within the specific symbolic framework, it may be fruitful to reformulate the Mishnah question as follows. Can one draw upon Christian, that is here Greco-Roman expertise and language, to warm our own Shabbat, moments of spiritual comfort? The miliarium and the antichi offers a suggestive metaphor for the kind of interreligious engagement I have experienced. Both are designed to preserve heat so that it can later be shared. Yet the halachic ruling permits the use of one and forbids the other, because maybe not all forms of warming are acceptable. In this sense, the text of the Mishnah articulates a boundary. There are ways of benefiting from the heat of the other that preserve one's integrity, and there are ways that imperils one's integrity. This is the fraternity, and this is its refusal. So how does one find a path to experience this ambiguity between a fraternity that seeks theological warmth and simultaneously expresses its refusal? Let me move to try and find a way to express this narrow path beyond the confine of academic discourse to acknowledge a personal reality. In moments of personal crisis, I have on many occasions sought counsels, not from rabbinic colleagues, but in truth, from Christian theologians and friends with whom I have shared long-standing bonds. What this encounter offered was not doctrine, nor a recitation of Catholic theological dogmas, nor was it what one might expect as a shared consolation in faith. More profoundly, the theological warmth this encounter conveyed laid in the sharing of a distinctive human experience, an experience that is shaped in the life of many of my Christian friends by their immersion in and their practice of their own theology. The warmth to which I allude was found in the human sensitivity that emerged as a refined byproduct of the lived theology and faith of those from whom I sought comfort. The human knowledge shaped by their theology maybe is the theological warmth that is permitted in fraternity. It is the miliarium the one we can drink from. But maybe the acceptance of doctrine, of dogma, maybe even of shared faith, might be a fraternity that crosses a boundary. It is maybe the antichi that we are not permitted to have. Such, at least, is my fraternal Jewish resistance, constantly in search for boundaries. Let me turn to the second movement. Nostra Aetate emphasizes God's enduring love for Israel for the sake of their fathers. There is beneath such a statement a fundamental assumption. We Jews are a people of faith. We are a people who believe like our ancestors did. And one can picture the assumption of a straight line of enduring faith across the generation that sustains the teaching of Nostra Aetate. And it is a beautiful narrative. Let me take the risk to bring Nostra Aetate back to reality and to shatter some convenient illusions. As Paul Celan wrote, "Speaks true who speaks shadows." So let me darken the picture. There is no such thing as a straight line of faith from our fathers down to many Jews today. Many Jews do not have the faith that you think we have and that you would like us to have. Many Jews do not believe, certainly not in the biblical image of faith, nor in the mainstream rabbinic understanding of faith. At minima, to seize a sense of this subjective religious theological experience of many contemporary Jews, I would simply cite the words of Eliezer Berkovitz, who wrote, and he said, "In our generations, we Jews, surviving the Shoah, we reason with God in what he calls believing rebellion and rebellious belief." And so what remains of Nostra Aetate if we move and remove the assumption of Jewish faith from the equation? Let me recall the powerful admonition of the Catholic theologian Johann Baptist Metz in 1980. He wrote, "The Church needs to stand in front of the Jews, that is, as they are, and not in front of Judaism, that means as a theorized construction." And so I would like us to meet, despite the assumption of Nostra Aetate, in the shadowy place of a certain Jewish unbelief. With possibly some audacity, it is towards the writing of Karl Barth that I would like to turn. And I'm aware of the risk in doing so here today. First, because I do not pretend to really understand his theology. And two, because he was, of course, not a Catholic, and his reception in Catholic circles was and still is somehow ambiguous. And third, because his own admitted posture towards Jews is, to put it mildly, very problematic. "I have a total irrational aversion towards living Jews," he wrote in 1967. Yet despite this hesitation, let me still cite Barth, because he, and maybe only he, has spoken so subtly about the reality of a possible Christian unbelief. Here's the passage that interests me. It appeared in a series of lectures on the Apostolic Creed that he gave in 1935 at the University of Utrecht. "We begin our conversation," he wrote, "of the doctrine of the death of Jesus Christ with a glance at the humblest part of our symbol, I mean the sepultus. Jesus Christ was buried? ? So, and this is the remarkable thing, there is a point, namely this point in the credo, where the word of the believer completely coincides with the word of the unbeliever. They use the same word, though they mean opposing things, but they use and they meet with the same language. This particular passage, where the contradictory experiences of faith and unbelief coincide, strike me as especially significant to broaden the theological horizon of interreligious reflection. Here is an articulation of a Christian possible unbelief, invited to share the word of the believer that carries genuine religious significance. Might this not suffice, from the perspective of dialogue, to render intelligible and to invite engagement with the blind spot of Jewish-Christian debates into which, until now, Nostra Aetate has not dared to venture. Dare expose us to those moments of your life where unbelief possibly erupts into your religious faith. Your probable hesitation to do so is the expression of the resistance of your fraternity, but this too is what I seek. Now, I started with Jabez, and I want to conclude with Jabez. Any dialogue is two condemned monologues facing each other. Fraternal violence. Who will judge us for this murder? It is no doubt a puzzling statement, yet it is also an affirmation that carries a truth that we should have the courage to face. A fraternity in resistance is not without risks. Too much resistance and dialogue turns into monologues, and they turn into violence, and ultimately it turns into murder. But too little resistance and the two voices merge into one. It is another form of monologue. Dialogue is in itself murdered. So 60 years after Nostra Aetate, it might not be so much dialogue as such that needs to be reassessed, but the awareness that the very topic of resistance in both parts need to be challenged. Not dialogue or resistance, not resisting dialogue, not even respecting resistance and leaving it untouched, as if this was a permanent angle of dark angle of Jewish-Christian relation. Rather, it is about engaging in a dialogue that presses gently but firmly on the points of resistance that define what both of us considered as the core of our deepest identity. Thank you very much.
David, thank you very, very much. And now, Etienne, may I ask you?
The title which you do not have of my talk is The Whole of Christian Theology, and then the shift of gravity of the Church towards the global South. And those are the 2 points that I will be speaking of. The whole of Christian theology and the shift of gravity of the Church towards the global South. 2 blind spots in Nostra Aetate 4 that the Council Fathers could maybe not have perceived. Looking back 60 years after Nostra Aetate 4, in the light of what was incohative in the text and in the light of further development, allows to perceive at least 2 very different aspects that the Council did not identify. Either this is the whole of theology, because the Council Fathers may not have realized how transformative it could be for the Catholic Church, or, and this is the second aspect, because of historical developments that they did not foresee. So my first point is about Catholic or Christian theology. Nostra Aetate has a much wider reaching and a deeper impact on the way the Church understands herself, on ecclesiology, and indeed on the whole of Catholic theology than what the text, the 4 pages of the texts present. The Council states that the Church draws sustenance from the root of the well-cultivated olive tree onto which have been grafted the wild shoots, the Gentiles. See Romans 11. We all know this. This sustains is a present tense. The roots are never the past of a tree. The roots are its present. The Council does not only have in mind the heritage of the Hebrew Bible, but a sustenance given to the Church by the present living Jewish people. In the same way, when Nostra Aetate states that the Council is brought to consider the mystery of Israel while it is, quote, searching or pondering into the mystery of the Church, or that God holds the Jews most dearly and does not repent of his gift, at that moment the Council may not have realized that these are not declarations that concern a niche or a secondary aspect of the Church, but that are central to her very being. And this we've seen in further developments since Nostra Aetate. Especially, I'm just going to pinpoint one moment out, when John Paul II spoke in 1980 about the Old Covenant never revoked, which is taken up by other authoritative church documents. So we have this in the Catechism of the Catholic Church, and we have this in Pope Francis's Evangelii Gaudium. And even in a more explicit way, in the 2015 documents, the Gifts and Calling insists that the Church, I quote, does not replace the people of Israel, and in a rather convoluted way, it asserts it is not possible to say that Israel is no longer the people of God. Now back to me, I'm not quoting anymore. If the gifts and calling of God are irrevocable, if Israel nourishes the Church now, and not only through the revelation of the past, the Jewish people can and should be called the people of God. However, the Second Vatican Council very frequently calls the Church people of God. So can both be people of God. In the Bible, Israel and the Church are very often called the spouse of God or the spouse of Christ. So the same question is God bigamous or polygamous? Nostra Aetate did not see this, but Nostra Aetate leads us to redefine what being the people of God means. The New Testament is quite clear about the fact that the Gentiles are brought to the God of Israel and to covenant relationship with God through the Jewish people as, and now I'm quoting Ephesians, co-citizens, co-heirs of the chosen one. And Romans, we know, speaks about a graft on the well-cultivated olive tree. This means that the Church mysteriously needs the Jewish people to be itself, as the graft needs the tree. The Church needs to be nourished. The Church needs to be whole through the Jewish people, or at least, okay, this is going to be a very Catholic sentence. The Church needs her wholeness not to be wounded. We see this in Unitatis Redintegratio, which is the document on unity, where it is both said that the Church is one, but that this oneness is wounded. And here we can say the Church is whole, but her wholeness is wounded by the lack of the original, the first people of God. Indeed, I would add, this is what I add, but I'm theologically completely convinced of this, the Church would disappear if the Jewish people were no more. This means that although the Church believes she can also be named people of God, the Jewish people are the first people of God, and when the expression people of God is used without added precision, it should be for the Jewish people. There is a priority of taxis, although not of dignity. Taxis in Greek means of order, although not of dignity, of the Jewish people. It's not only a question of chronology, it's a theological position. What does this mean? I would need ages to show what this means. I will just point out two aspects. The first aspect is it's deeply coherent with the way grace works. Grace is gratuitous. Grace means that we depend on someone else. And in this case, grace is both given immediately by God, but is also, in God's plan, transmitted by others. Differently, like the moon transmits light, it's not the sun, but if grace is not transmitted by others, then we become self-possessive of grace. And the church recognizes that she receives her being from the Jewish people. And she needs this. She is a people from a, you know how Germans love making sentences that are with lines, a people from another. This would be a people from another. Now, this is true also for the Jewish people, because the Jewish people has a calling, which is to be a light to the nations. So the Jewish people is a people for another, which means that its relation to the other is intrinsic and is part of its being. But here we have two, a people of another and a people for another. The other dimension is that if we believe that the Jewish people is still the people of God and still receives the gifts which enable her or it to be the people of God, it means that God guides the Jewish people when they read the Bible. And so, should we not consider rabbinic literature as illuminated by God? Should we not do that? And if this is the case, the Catholic Church cannot understand the scriptures without the Jewish people, and cannot understand ourselves without the Jewish people. We are not studying together only, and this is already enormous, to enrich each other and to know each other. We're studying together to learn something about Revelation. And we hope the same is true or could be true the other way around. But I won't say anything about that. And this also has consequences for the sacraments. For example, I'm skipping a bit for the translators, but the sacrament of baptism has always been considered as what brings someone into the body of Christ. Okay, that's clear and very Christian, but also into the people of God. But if we have just said that the people of God are the Jewish people, it means that mysteriously, and I don't want to impose this on Jews, this is really Catholic theology, but according to Catholic theology, the baptism would also relate the baptized person to the first people of God, who is Israel. This is an idea that you can find already, not in a very precise way, but you can still find it in Cardinal Lustiger. I'm going to quote Lustiger. In baptism, we are incorporated into Christ, but baptism is, in the same time and inseparably, otherwise it would be meaningless, an incorporation into Israel. Through Christian baptism, pagans are received into the people of God. We could go on and on. The whole of Christian theology needs to be renewed by taking into consideration the enduring quality of the Old Covenant, including the central treatises of soteriology, Christology, and Trinity. That this has not been done yet explains why many honestly try to follow Nostra Aetate, but easily fall back into old schemes of thoughts on ritualistic Pharisees, on the law versus grace, on justification versus mitzvot. And let us remember that during the 20th century, biblical, liturgical, and ecumenical movements in the Catholic Church allowed for a huge shift. It wasn't a revolution, but it was a huge evolution, which means that the studies did not only change the topics of Bible, liturgy, or ecclesiology, but working working in these fields transformed the whole way we do theology. I think we are at a point where this has become necessary and possible through Jewish-Christian dialogue. But that was the first point. How many minutes? Ah! Really? Okay.
The whole of Christian theology in 13 minutes?
No, but now I'm on a second point. Okay. The other blind spot that I would have loved to address is how the shift of gravity of the church towards the global south will present challenges and opportunities that Nostra Aetate could not have imagined. It is undeniable that in a generation or two, these are regions of the world where the majority of Christians and Catholics will be found. The capitals of Christianity will not be Rome, Constantinople, or Moscow and Geneva. They will be Buenos Aires, Kinshasa, and Manila. And big changes like this have happened often in the church, or 3 or 4 times, let's say, and have always brought great opportunities, but also great challenges for adaptation. I'm going to try to just pinpoint what the difficulties are, and maybe, let's say, avenues of solution, but probably I will be stopped before I can do that. But the difficulties are that, as regards Jewish-Christian relations, this means that Christianity will be thriving in places where Christians will sometimes have never met a Jew, in places where there has not been the living experience of rich and fruitful diasporic Jewish life, which has often intertwined with local culture in countries where Jews live. This will also be in regions far away from where the Shoah took place, knowing that the Shoah has had a tremendous impact in defining Jewish self-understanding and in Christians' relations to Jews. So how will Christians in the global south, I'm quoting the council, draw sustenance from the Jewish people? Or to say it in another way, what motivation will they have to learn about and love the Jewish people? And another aspect is the experience of having been colonized means that the foundation of the modern state of Israel can tend to be read according to the lenses of colonization, and thus strongly rejected, and that the plight of the Palestinian people approached with categories of post-colonialist liberation theology. And finally, the shift of gravity of Christianity to the global south is not only a question of numbers, but also of the way Christian faith will be expressed. Many analyses stress how much more religious and spiritual daily life in southern countries is. This is certainly enriching, but some fear that it may not allow for the secular, and when I say secular, I make a difference between secular and secularized. Some fear that this may not allow for the secular civil society and state that in the West have allowed, on the one hand, freedom of religion, with enormously positive consequences for Jews living in these societies to be themselves, and on the other hand, an open space for dialogue. And now I have a bunch of possible answers, and that will be for another time.
Thanks for opening the space for further discussions. Come.
Good afternoon. Shalom. I'll start by thanking our hosts here at the Gregoriana for the organization of this stimulating and important event, and by saying how happy I am to share my thoughts in this forum, especially in the presence of true friends, with whom I had the privilege of building long and fruitful relationships. We gathered here to speak about a text called Nostra Aetate in our time, 60 years after it was written. This text introduced a paradigmatic breakthrough in Jewish-Catholic relations. Yet today, when we come to speak of this text, we cannot ignore the fact that the Jewish-Catholic relationship had been recently experiencing a serious crisis. This crisis is a fact known to both Catholics and Jews, and it must somehow be acknowledged in this event where we can hear the heartbeat of this relationship. Notwithstanding the great achievements of the last 6 decades, it has been extremely hard to engage in dialogue over the past 2 years. Neither side, so it seemed, wished to cease their ongoing engagement in that dialogue. Yet the discrepancies between the expectations of Catholics just a moment, and those of Jews, and the different formulations of what this dialogue should entail, and no less importantly, what it should not entail, grew ever stronger. The common ground, which was so diligently cultivated between Jews and Catholics ever since Nostra Aetate, suddenly seemed narrower, while the differences became harder to tolerate. Of course, the crisis of our time is not at all confined to the 4th section of Nostra Aetate and spreads over the entire text. In its opening, the declaration describes the time as one in which, day by day, mankind is being drawn closer together and the ties between different peoples are becoming stronger. Our time seems to suggest otherwise. Our world grows constantly apart. Day by day, divisions become deeper and peoples are pulled away from each other. The temptation of separation, of polarization, of cleansing ourselves from those we see as ideologically or politically repugnant is ever more imminent. We therefore must rise to the challenge of reading Nostra Aetate in our time, reading it Nostra Aetate. While in the 1960s, our task was one of creative conciliation, of gluing together the different parts of our broken world, today our task is to hold that world we built together in one piece, to resist the forces which threaten to shatter it, to divide it into its different components and destroy the delicate craft of the shared space we have invested so much in opening. This is a different task. It is less redemptive and more catechonic. It is less optimistic and more hesitant. It is less progressive and more conservative, as it aspires to preserve and to resist the total decline of our overly human, fallen civilization, rather than to bring closer the eschatological kingdom of God. I will therefore suggest to read Nostra Aetate 4 as not as a redemptive text, signifying a definitive conciliation between Jews and Christians after centuries of mutual enmity, which was basically the way we used to read it until not long ago, but rather more modestly as a text which can teach us how to sustain ambivalence without deteriorating into demonization, how to resist the urge to juxtapose the difficult other against the self in order to cultivate a false sense of the self as integral and safe from the evil which lies always elsewhere. I will therefore use this exceptional honor of being invited to speak as a Jewish person here at the heart of the Catholic intellectual world in order to revisit the complex place of the Jews as both insiders and outsiders, as both the Church's other and as an integral part of the Church's self. I will suggest that Nostra Aetate does not render inoperative the multiple tensions between the two communities so profoundly entangled with one another. Instead, it reminds that the entanglement, even when awkward and uneasy, is unresolvable without destroying both self and other, at least not before the end of time. Nostra Aetate 4 clarifies that it does not see Jews as ultimate others. in negating the deicide charge, that is, the accusation of the Jews as collectively responsible for the crucifixion in every generation, the council renounced a view of the Jews as satanic or as enemies. No longer ultimate others, the council had now turned to the Jews as part of the church's self. The church's discussion of her relationship with the Jewish people is done by looking inward, by knowing herself. The Jewish section opens with the words, as the Sacred Synod searches into the mystery of the church, it remembers the bond that spiritually ties the people of the New Covenant to Abraham's stock. Because of this sense in which Judaism is intrinsic to the church, to use John Paul II's terminology, Nostra Aetate had clarified the church's relation to Jews and Judaism not through examining historical Judaism, a tradition or a family of traditions which evolved in parallel to Christianity, but rather through an investigation of the church's own memory. The few paragraphs composing Nostra Aetate 4 are full of verbs describing memory. The church recalls, she cannot forget, she keeps ever in mind, and she remembers. In relating to Section 3, Dan Madigan has mentioned yesterday the problems involved in the Council's call to forget the past of Christian-Muslim rivalry and focus on the future. Yet Section's 4 extensive call for remembrance comes with its own difficulties. As many scholars have noted, the risk of searching for Jews within Christian memory, that is, of looking into the past and into the self, is neglecting to think through the relationship between those internal Jewish figures who serve as theological categories and the actual fate of contemporary Jews who have remained outside the church. And you already mentioned Metz, David, so I think this is my point too. When the church remembered, she remembered the beginnings of her faith, the shared patrimony, the ancient covenant, the roots, as well as the fact that Mary, the apostles, Christ, and many of his early disciples sprang from the Jewish people, as the declaration has it. However, the text remained equivocal as for the connection between this set of memories and the current relationship between Jews and Christians, and risked in reducing Jews into theological abstractions without real existential thickness. Yet, on the other hand, this search inside also provided a critical acknowledgement that the Jews never exist only on the outside, but rather the Christian gaze on them is always conditioned through traditional categories. Purifying the intra-Christian theological categories for thinking about Jews and Judaism is therefore no less crucial for amending the actual relationship than any actual encounter, since all actual encounters are bound to be deciphered through some Christian hermeneutical lens. And in truth, is it not the case in all intimate relationships? Later, in the 1980s, John Paul II had built on the Council's ambiguous language to articulate the entanglement of past and present, of the Jews within and of the Jews without, and especially of their place as others who nonetheless remain within, as paradigmatic for Jewish-Christian relations. It's a long citation. The first dimension of this dialogue, that is, the meeting between the people of God of the Old Covenant, never revoked by God, and that of the New Covenant, is at the same time a dialogue within our church, that is to say, between the first and second part of her Bible. A second dimension of our dialogue, the true and central one, is the meeting between present-day Christian churches and the present-day people of the covenant concluded with Moses. Here, a note of historical context is required. It should be recalled that the need expressed by the Council to remind the Church of her indebtedness to the Jewish people and tradition emerged from the need to counter anti-Jewish theological trends prevalent in the European Christian world in previous generations. This indebtedness, this stress on the common, on the continuous, on the fraternal, came as an antidote to Christian theologies who have sought to purge the Christian canon of its Old Testament and connected this purgation with an irreconcilable antagonism between Christians and Jews. As Susanna Heschel has shown, theologies who sought to liberate Christianity from the abhorrent influence of the Old Testament gained their popularity while Europe sought to liberate itself from the abhorrent influence of its Jews. An analogy, if not worse, existed, therefore, between political anti-Semitism and between Christian theological speculation. Facing these trends, Jacques Maritain, Henri de Lubac, and other mounting Catholic theologians, together with the Reformed theologian Karl Barth, have insisted since the 1930s and 1940s that an affirmation of Orthodox Christian faith, and particularly of the validity of a sacred canon which includes the Hebrew Bible within its body, goes hand in hand with a rejection of anti-Semitism. In other words, they have delineated a Gordian knot between the Church's relation to the Jews and their textual traditions within her own sources and the Jews of post-crucifixion history. Moreover, these theologians have identified the call to purge Christianity of the obsolete residues of the vulgar Hebrew texts as endangering not only Christian morality toward non-Christians, but as provoking an autoimmune attack on Christianity's Jewish roots. Anti-Semitism, in this view, was dangerous for the Church. Of course, anti-Semitism was more dangerous for Jews than it was for the Church, and many scholars have justly criticized this depiction as if the real victims of anti-Semitism were, in fact, the Christians. And yet, for the purpose of this talk, I would like to highlight another aspect of this argument. The danger was indeed that pushing out what causes irritation for the sake of promoting a homogeneous reign of peace, a realm of profound sameness which tolerates only its likes, ends up turning into destruction, hatred, and annihilation which do not only destroy the other, but also consume the self. A striking articulation of this danger, I believe, can be found in Joseph Ratzinger's introduction to the Pontifical Biblical Commission's 2002 text, The Jewish People and Their Sacred Scriptures in the Christian Bible. And note the precision of this title. In a document that seeks to raise a contribution to appeasing the great hermeneutical tension between Jewish and Christian readings of the Hebrew Bible, Ratzinger chose to surface a profound ambivalence towards the Old Testament within central Christian sources. Reading Augustine's Confessions, he described the terrible disappointment that the literate North African intellectual had experienced when going through, I quote, the exacting legal prescriptions of the Old Testament, its complex and at times brutal narratives, in which Augustine, I quote again, failed to find that wisdom towards which he wanted to travel. As many other Christian authors throughout history, he has found the Hebrew text coarse and obsolete. Perplexed by the ruthlessness of the Old Testament, Ratzinger argues, Augustine, and I quote, encountered a certain people who proclaimed a new spiritual Christianity, one which understood the Old Testament as spiritually deficient and repugnant, a Christianity in which Christ had no need of the witness of the Hebrew prophets. Those people promised him a Christianity of poor and simple reason, a Christianity in which Christ was the great illuminator, leading human beings to the true self-knowledge. These were the Manichaeans. In the end, however, Augustine learned how to interpret this collection of foreign texts, speaking of a foreign people in a foreign tongue, as an essential part of the Christian canon, of the Church's own journey through time. The Old Testament is newly interpreted in light of the New, yet at the same time it remains in its unconverted otherness within the canon. Indeed, neither Augustine nor Ratzinger, nor many other Catholic theologians have ever renounced their ambivalence towards the Old Testament as long as it is not read Christologically. What Christians sometimes forget is that Jews too have never been at ease with these very same texts. It is also true that the Christian unease towards the Old Testament as a collection of texts describing the conflictual, difficult, and uncanny history of a particular people linked to a particular piece of land may well be related to another kind of an unease towards a more contemporary, conflictual, difficult, and uncanny history of a particular people linked to a particular piece of land. The history of Israel, in its many configurations, has a complex place within the Christian tradition, one that resists a simple categorization. It is an other whose integration into the Christian self can be slow and threatening, and at times it requires an overcoming of a certain object. And yet, the existential choice the Church has made time and again throughout its history has been to leave this history, these texts, and these people inside, notwithstanding their relentless, at times threatening, and certainly unredeemed otherness. It is this capacity to sustain otherness, not to annihilate it, nor to dissolve it into sameness, which enables history to continue its course. Let us therefore sustain it. Thank you.
Grazie mille, Karma. Axel, you have not the last words, but...
Let me express my gratitude and my deep feeling of honor that I can join you here at this important conference as a German Protestant Lutheran theologian. And I was asked to say something about the impact of Nostra Aetate on Protestantism. This is not an easy task. The problem is that we don't have the Protestantism, we have many Protestantisms, and therefore we have many Protestant-Jewish dialogues. We have a great variety of it. Some dialogues already begun before 1965. As a German theologian, I will put an emphasis on German context. Nostra Aetate gave all the efforts, also in the Protestant world, a new momentum and made them even more urgent. Explicit references to Nostra Aetate are rare, and this is the other difficulty. Therefore, direct causal links are hard to prove. But we can see clear convergences between Catholic and Protestant developments. The rejection of anti-Semitism, the critique of supersessionism, and the rediscovery of the Jewish roots of Christian faith. From the 1970s onwards, both the Roman Catholic Church and various Protestant churches began to reshape teaching, liturgy, and theology in light of a renewed understanding of God's covenant with Israel. This process goes on to the present and has to be continued in the future. Already immediately after 1945, some Protestant churches had started to confront their theological legacy. In 1946, the Dutch Reformed Church and the Hungarian Reformed Church issued statements promoting a new understanding of Jewish-Christian relations. Protestant theologians worked together with Catholic theologians and Jews on the drafting and adaptation of the Seelisberg Thesis in 1947. In 1950, the Synod of the Evangelical Church in Germany, EKD, adopted a short word on the Jewish question, which addressed important questions like guilt of German Christians or combating anti-Semitism. Still, for nearly 2 decades, these efforts did not lead to further significant official statements of Protestant churches. The adoption of Nostra Aetate in 1965 marked a turning point. It strengthened Protestant theologians already working toward renewal and encouraged churches to take the next step. Beginning with the late 1960s, numerous Protestant churches produced statements on Jewish-Christian relations. Strongly influenced by Protestant theologians from Europe and North America, the Faith and Order Commission of the World Council of Churches called in its Bristol report in 1967 for a new and far-reaching theological reflection on Jewish-Christian relations. That same year, the EKD established a commission that produced the study Christian Jews, adopted in 1975 and followed by 2 additional volumes in 1991 and 2000. Ecumenical cooperation grew among theologians and committed Christians. In 1971, German Catholics and Protestants formed a temporary working group on Jews and Christians, emphasizing that Christian unity was incomplete without dialogue with Judaism. Their declaration rejected attempts of evangelizing Jews and recognized the Jewish roots of Christian faith. The 1980 statement of the Synod of the Protestant Church in the Rhineland went even further and became a milestone for German Protestantism. Among German-speaking Protestants, some leading theologians reflected on Nostra Aetate. Edmund Schlink, official observer of the EKD at Vatican II, appreciated Cardinal Bea's theological foundation for the chapter on the Jews very much, but regretted the lack of acknowledgement of the Church's historical complicity in anti-Semitism. Karl Barth, who had a great interest in the Vatican Council, visited Rome shortly after Nostra Aetate. He welcomed the declaration but questioned why the Jewish-Christian relations were placed among non-Christian religions. For Barth, the division between church and synagogue represented Christianity's most fundamental schism and the true and central ecumenical challenge. Jürgen Moltmann described Nostra Aetate as a turning point in Catholic-Jewish relations too. He compared it with earlier Protestant statements, noting that both affirmed Israel's continuing vocation as God's people. Yet, Moltmann criticized the Catholic text for treating Israel merely as a preparatory step toward the church, rather than a living partner in God's ongoing covenant. Friedrich Wilhelm Marquardt valued Nostra Aetate for rejecting the charge of deicide and affirming Jesus' death as sign for God's love for all humanity and not as a justification for Jew hatred. Still, he regretted its silence on important questions such as mission on the Jews, the theology of the land and state of Israel, and a Christian theology after the Shoah. He hoped that Christian theology would one day recognize Jewish-Christian relations as the very center of any Christian ecumenism. Like his teacher Barth, Marquardt considered that the decree on ecumenism Unitatis Redintegratio would have been the appropriate place for a Vatican statement on Jewish-Christian relations. But both of them knew well the debates that preceded Nostra Aetate IV. The establishment of the Commission for Religious Relations with the Jews and its attachment to the Secretariat of Christian Unity, respectively, the Pontifical Council for Promoting Christian Unity, shows that there was a common concern for this issue. The conversation about the church and the Jewish people was never confined to a single denomination or country. The World Council of Churches had already wrestled with these issues in the 1950s. At Evanston in 1955, it failed to reach consensus on a new approach to Judaism, and there the shift to the global south already emerged. At New Delhi in 1961, it spoke against anti-Semitism only. Pioneering positive statements about Judaism and Jewish-Christian relations were and are very rare in the history of the WCC. They didn't receive wide attention within the WCC. The Bristol report already mentioned above and the Sigtuna Declaration from 1988 later built on the efforts to establish a new theological understanding of Jewish-Christian relations. Both documents echo many themes of Nostra Aetate and recognize that encounter with Jewish tradition and Jewish presence is essential for Christian identity and theology. Reservations and objections triggered by the Arab-Palestinian-Israeli conflicts were already present at 1955 Assembly at Evanston, remained influential in the past, and became even more effective in recent times. In the year 2001, the Community of Protestant Churches of Europe adopted the comprehensive study Church in Israel. It calls it Churches of the Reformation to renewed theological and practical relationship with Judaism. It affirms Israel's enduring election, rejects all forms of Jew hatred, and defines the Church's identity as inseparably linked to Israel. True witness means repentance, dialogue, and shared responsibility for justice and peace. Since almost every Protestant church in Europe has adopted this document, almost 100 Protestant churches, this could have been our Nostra Aetate moment. But unfortunately, this document is hardly known and poor received. It's a lengthy study and lacks a concise summary. In 1950, the EKD Berlin-Weißensee Declaration affirmed Christ's Jewish origin, condemned anti-Semitism, and acknowledged complicity for the atrocities against the Jews. It also affirmed that God's promise to the Jewish people remains valid even after the crucifixion of Jesus. A more sustained effort came with the founding of the working group Jews and Christians at the German Kirchentag Church Assembly in 1961. Its members, both Jewish and Christian, declared that Jews and Christians are inseparably linked and condemned any form of hostility toward Jews as godless and self-destructive. The group became a lasting center of theological thinking and educational reform up to now. The EKD's 1975 study, Christian Jews, explored the shared roots of faith, the historical separation of church and synagogue, and the challenges of contemporary dialogue. It affirmed Israel's ongoing election, called the German Christians for solidarity with the State of Israel, and expressed its hope for the just balance of interests between both Jews and Palestinians. Two further studies in 1991 and 2000 deepened and continued these insights. The 1980 Rhineland Declaration, meanwhile, became a milestone, as I said. It confessed Christian guilt for the Holocaust, rejected mission to Jews, and interpreted the existence of the State of Israel as a sign of God's faithfulness. None of these statements and remarkable efforts became as well known and influential as Nostra Aetate. Therefore, we must consider significant structural differences. Protestant churches lack a centralized authority. Decisions are made often regionally and have limited scope. Many declarations exist only in national languages and remain unknown. The diversity of Protestantism encourages debate, but complicates consistent reception. Official Protestant statements are often long and complex studies, less accessible than brief statements like Nostra Aetate. While new understandings of Judaism have entered church constitutions and theological education within both Protestantism and Catholicism, anti-Semitic stereotypes persist. Empirical studies show that traditional anti-Jewish attitudes remain present among Christians of all denominations. Academic theology has made significant progress. Biblical scholarship, historical studies, and interfaith cooperation are now natural and fruitful. Yet, practical implementation in parishes, schools, and public discourse remains an important task for all Christian denominations. Looking back over 6 decades, Nostra Aetate stands as a milestone. For Protestant churches, it served less as a blueprint than as a mirror. It confirmed and encouraged developments already underway. inspire deeper theological reflection and reconsidering the crucial meaning of Jewish-Christian relations for our faith. It reminded all Christians that the change towards repentance and reconciliation with the Jewish people is not a marginal concern, but central to our understanding of God, the Church, and the hope for the world. It continues to challenge us to critically revisiting and renewing our own traditions. It challenges us to teach responsibly and to live our faith in humility and respect, remembering that without Judaism, there is no Christianity. Thank you for your patience.
Axel, thank you so much for your talk. This is our Nostra Aetate moment. I want to quote you. This is our Nostra Aetate moment. And I quote also the prospect of our conference. 60 years after its promulgation, the need arises not only to celebrate the importance and relevance of Nostra Aetate, but also to reconsider it in light of theological development, new interreligious encounters, and a changing political, social, religious environment. The talks of our 5 speakers dealt with Nostra Aetate as a document with high authority, but also as an open text. An open text, Nostra Aetate opens the space for rethinking new questions and other topics. The second part of our panel allows us and you all to deal with Nostra Aetate as an open text. And so I'm looking forward to your comments, to your questions, to your contributions after a 10 minutes break. And I would like to ask you to come back in time so you won't miss the Nostra Aetate moment of our 5 speakers. Thanks a lot.